Chief of Defence Force, Commander Sri Lanka Army, distinguished generals, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you. It is a distinct pleasure for me to stand before you this morning, and I would like to begin by thanking the Sri Lanka Army for this kind invitation and opportunity, and for the very warm hospitality that has been extended to us. Once again, a warm thank you to all of you. This morning, I will share some of my ideas with you on an issue that is critically important to all armies around the world today, and that is the subject of disaster mitigation and disaster management. As you all agree with me, the disasters are as old as mankind. The first description of disasters can be found in the management that came from Noah and his ark. And similarly, we are today faced with a plethora of situations of disasters that face our country every single year, and every single army is called upon to manage this. If we want to define disaster, it can be described as a disaster can be defined as an occurrence, either nature or man-made, that causes human suffering and creates human needs that victims cannot alleviate without assistance. A disaster in any occurrence that causes damage, ecological disruptions, loss of human life, deterioration of health services on a scale sufficient to warrant an extraordinary response from outside that affected community or the area. So disaster is primarily a situation that calls for help, and one of the key players to help people affected in disasters are always the military. If we look at the progression of vulnerability, there are several areas that comes to our attention. It comes from root causes, as you can see on the screen. It falls under the dynamic process, which is lack of training, local investment, and press freedom. It goes on to unsafe conditions of physical environment, local economy, social relations, and public actions. How is a disaster caused? The way you can analyze this is that natural hazards, when it collides with progression of vulnerability, is a point when a disaster is caused. So it's therefore risk and hazard comes to impact on vulnerability, and hazards impacts on vulnerable people in the worst possible manner. We can classify disasters in two broad categories. That could be natural disasters, examples like hurricane, tornado, earthquake, tsunami, flood, and I'm sure the audience here will be accustomed and familiar with most of them. We could also have man-made disasters like fire, transport accidents, industrial accidents, oil spills, nuclear radiation accidents, nuclear explosions, and the likes of those. So, when we talk of the categories of disasters, the disasters that come and face us every year are mostly natural, but there are also man-made disasters that face us and challenge us quite frequently. In terms of the natural disasters, what has now become critical is the impact of climate change. Climate change is making our disaster scenario far, far more complex than we have been accustomed to. As we face more natural disasters, the climate change impacts bring more lethality and frequency to our disaster scenarios. And unfortunately, they are likely to aggravate in the years to come. I would like to only lay before you a single example of a natural disaster that is likely to come and face us in many, many countries, including your own country, Sri Lanka, is the case of sea level rise. The sea level is rising, and is rising at a pace faster than it has ever risen before. It is even now breaking all scientific projections, and if the sea level rises, then 1/3 of the global population will be either displaced or directly affected. You would agree with me that a vast majority of the global population lives within 100 kilometers of the sea. Therefore, any impacts of sea level rise will have direct impact on people's habitation, people's life, their economic well-being, and their safety and security. And when that comes, the militaries of the world will have a gigantic task in their hand. The consequences of disasters are all-encompassing, but the key areas in which it strikes is health. It has tremendous negative effect on human health. It naturally has destructive power on all structures on which falls on its path. There are ecological damages, and of course, there is substantial economical loss. Over the couple of years, if you see the statistics, the damage in economic terms has been to the tune in the last few years to the tune of 1.4 trillion US dollars. And similarly, the number of affected people are 1.2 billion people have been directly affected. It has 0.07 million people that were killed in the disasters in the last few years. So the statistics themselves show that there is a direct increasing trend in both the number of disasters and the effect it has on human lives and the national and global economy. Disaster mitigation is an important part of trying to cope with disasters. It relates to the minimizing the effects of disasters. For example, building a codes of zoning, vulnerability analysis, and public education. It refers to the measures taken in order to remove or decrease the risk or impacts of hazards through proactive and predetermined measures. The main motive of mitigation is to reduce the loss of life and property by reducing the impact of disasters. The way it can be done, the components of mitigation can be our hazard analysis and vulnerability analysis. In hazard analysis, what we do is it's a phenomenon, the type of disasters and the intensity is analyzed. And in vulnerability, it states the predisposition and the capacity of local response. And when we analyze impacts, it denotes to the effect on human life or on the population. So there are phases of phenomenon, vulnerability, that together sums up to impacts. We then come to the factors of vulnerability analysis, which means the number of people exposed to hazards, the area covered by hazards, the intensity or power of the hazards that it impacts, the time and duration of the hazards, and the frequency by which the hazards impact. And a combination or part of those combination together form the factors of vulnerability analysis. In structural and non-structural mitigation, we have to do both. In structural mitigation, it deals with the construction of projects that are aimed to reducing the economic and social impacts of disasters. And in non-structural mitigation, we take measures that seek to reduce the likelihood of risks through the modification of human behavior or human practices. The examples of structural measures for mitigation could be strengthening of infrastructure, for example, checking our existing dams or building codes and policies. And in non-structural measures, it could be public health campaigns, vaccination programs, educating people, bringing up people's awareness to disasters, and many more. We then come to discuss on what is a disaster management. It is applied science which sits by systematic observation and analysis of disasters to improve measures relating to prevention, emergency, response, recovery, and mitigation. It encompasses all aspects of planning for and responding to disasters, including both pre- and post-disaster activities. It's a continuous process, and it is an integrated process of planning, organizing, coordinating, and implementing measures which are necessary for a number of fields of activity, and they are preventing of danger or threat of disasters, reduction of risk of any disaster or its severity in impacting on people. It means also preparedness to deal with any disaster situation, prompt response to a threatening disaster situation or disaster scenario. It also involves assessing the severity and the magnitude of the effects of disaster on both people and property. And finally, it also involves rehabilitation and reconstitution of assets. Normally, a disaster management goes through certain phases of activities, and they are also interlinked to one another. It starts with disaster preparedness, then we have disaster impact, which is actually when the disaster is happening. Immediately after the disaster, we go into disaster response phase, and together with the response phase and after the response phase, we enter a disaster recovery phase. And the process of disaster mitigation then carries out throughout the process. So these are the phases that are almost interlinked and are mutually supporting to one another. We are now calling for an integrated disaster management system in which preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation all can go in a cyclic order, helping one another. It goes into a cycle, again, as I explained, into preparedness, to response, to recovery, to prevention. And prevention is normally identified as to minimize the risk posed by the buildings, its equipment and fittings, natural hazards of the area. When you talk of preparedness, it refers to the steps for getting prepared to cope with the disasters. The example could be keep together supplies or equipment that are normally necessary to cope with the disaster management phase. In response, we normally identify it refers to the measures taken when a disaster strikes. And in recovery, it refers to the initiatives taken in order to restore a disaster site, which normally involves rehabilitation of a disaster site. There is an emphasis and a particular role of the medical sector in the overall management of the disasters throughout. It happens with pre-hospital emergency services. It goes on to the assessment of the immediate health needs of the people during the disaster phase and in the post-disaster phase. It has an identification of medical and health resources that are necessary to cope with the disaster phase and post-disaster phase. It also means the assets of temporary field treatment capacity in the medical sector. But overall, the medical sector has a critical role to play in all disaster management, both during the disaster and in the post-disaster phase. The use of technology today is becoming critical in overall disaster management. Without the use of technology, we can no longer provide the efficient services in disaster management that is necessary to provide a service that the peoples need. Today, we are in the process of integrating and using equipments like drones, remote sensing. We are in the process of using satellite data. We are in the process of using satellite communication in all disaster sites. They not only increase our responses, they are extremely effective on the ground, both for the first responders and also for the people and the victims. The use of data, the use of big data, the use of social media have now become critically important in our disaster management tools. The use of social media has proved to be extremely useful in the case of, for example, the Philippines typhoon and the post-typhoon period. With the use of technology of social media and the internet, we are today able to interact with the victims. So it has now become, disaster management has now become a two-way traffic, where the first responders don't act on their own, but they act with the response from the victims on the ground. It helps us to channelize the resources in the right direction and make the need assessment far more realistic than before. The use of drones, for example, has given us the capacity to have real-life feel and feed from the ground, which was not accessible to us before, and these are the capacities that must be integrated into all our disaster management capacity. There is also a need for international cooperation in disaster management. In most cases, national capacity is overwhelmed when a disaster strikes. In many cases, nations go into a phase of a complex emergency. And as you'd agree and know that a complex emergency is a situation where the national capacity is unable to cope with the needs of the hour. And that is the period when international cooperation comes into call. There are mechanisms for international cooperation at the level of the United Nations. There are measures of international cooperation available at the regional level. For example, ASEAN has a AHA center based in Jakarta. SAARC has disaster management conventions and capacities at the regional level, and all our countries must become familiar to those regional and international capacities that are available and can be called at times of need. Managing international cooperation is also a complex business. Unless it is planned well ahead, unless it has been taken into cognizance at all levels of planning, international cooperation cannot be integrated into disaster management during or in the post-disaster phase. The example that is available to us is the case of the Nepal earthquake, when the international cooperation came at such a level and such a pace that Nepal was unable to cope with the flow of international support that was coming to them. So getting international help is necessary, but managing them is again a matter of planning, and it's a complex business. International cooperation and development is another aspect that needs to be taken into cognizance, because many of our development goals are completely derailed due to disasters and its impacts. I would particularly like to say that many of our SDG goals can be derailed and can be taken off track if we are struck by disasters and are unable to cope with it. Disaster risk reduction is another factor that needs to be taken into consideration. For lack of time, I will not go into explanation. We need to understand emergency operation plans that needs to be put into operation. in times of disasters. The role of NGOs in both disaster mitigation and management has become critically important today, and the role of the media is again extremely vital in managing disasters. What I would like to do now over the last minute that I have is just to share my ideas as to what the militaries should do to prepare for this kind of a situation. What are the key elements that they should remember in coping and managing disasters? The militaries must train itself for disasters. It's a role, a secondary role that all our armies will have to be performing and will be called upon to perform. So the militaries must train for the secondary role of disaster management. Together with training, it must also equip itself to do the management that it is needed to do, and it might need special equipment. There should be elements of joint training with NGOs, civil society organizations, and community organizations in the field, because disaster management will now become a joint operation of all these elements. There also has to be a multinational training program to train with other militaries and other nationals who would normally come to help in case of a disaster call. I would also like to say that the militaries today must earmark response teams in advance so they have a quick response capacity, because the window of survival is very, very critical and is very short in time. Therefore, we must have light teams to deploy in the field at the quickest manner. The militaries must plan and have multiple contingency plans to cope with disasters. I did explain that technology must be integrated in all our planning processes. It is important for us to remember that an integrated disaster management response capacity of a nation will always be civilian-led. The military is only one particular component of the whole response capacity of the nation, and it must be civilian-led, and the military must support the civilian authorities. It must be part of a national plan, and the plan will be an integrated plan. It is important for us to remember that the military must increase its capacity in certain special areas like mobility and lift, like mobile medical teams, like water purification capacity, and the likes. It is extremely important for the militaries today to understand and take a grip of the impacts of climate change that are happening or will happen in a large manner in the years to come, and that will need a different kind of response in disaster management capacities of the military. So the military must understand the impacts of climate change and devise techniques and methods how to cope with them. And finally, the military should also understand what is the exit plan after a disaster management response, and therefore also begin to understand the process of transitioning. In the end, I would like to say that a soldier is trained to fight, but equally he's trained to save lives in his own country, in other countries, and allied countries when a disaster strikes and is called upon to help people. It is a critical task, and this task will be performed more and more frequently in the future. Therefore, all militaries must stand up, train itself, equip itself, and come to play this noble duty and responsibility for which it may be called. Thank you all very much for your patient hearing.